Guys, welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. This is episode number 418, and this is going to be a great episode with Jim Heffelfinger of the Arizona Game and Fish Department. We're going to be talking about a kind of a sensitive subject here on wolves, but before we get to that, I want to thank the sponsors of this podcast. I want to thank GoHunt.com Insider for their title sponsorship of this podcast. And I want to remind you guys that you can sign up for an insider membership. And if you don't have an insider membership and you apply in any of the western states, I highly recommend this resource. It is the best resource out there to investigate draw odds and harvest statistics and other pertinent data for applying for these states. You can use the J. Scott promo code when signing up. You're actually going to get a $50 Go Hunt Gear Shop gift card. You can immediately buy something with that gift card, or you could put it towards another purchase, or you can use it to accumulate points. Go Hunt Insider is also a phenomenal resource when it comes to their strategy articles and how to apply in these different states. So I can't encourage you enough to sign up for a Go Hunt Insider membership. I also want to thank KUIU.com. That's KUIU.com. KUIU makes the best ultralight hunting gear available on the market today. Also want to thank phonescope.com, Cheston Davis and his crew over there. If you use the JScott16 promo code, you're going to get a 10% discount on all products at phonescope.com. And the Outdoorsmans, the optics authority there in Arizona. Use the JScott promo code and you're going to get a 10% discount on all products there. You can call them 1-800-291-8065 or go to outdoorsmans.com. Guys, thanks for all your avid support. We have set another record monthly podcast numbers last month in March, and just really appreciate all the feedback and the support that you guys give this podcast. Let's get right to this episode. If you have any questions or concerns in regards to this podcast, comments, what have you, you can email me at jscottoutdoors@gmail.com. Please encourage you to follow along on my Instagram page as well, jscottoutdoors. You can send me an Instagram message there. So let's get right to this episode.
Welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. Today is going to be a fun episode with Jim Heffelfinger from the Arizona Game and Fish Department. Jim is a certified wildlife biologist with degrees in wildlife management from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and Texas A&M, I believe, at Kingsmill. Is that right, Jim?
Kingsville, that's right. And coincidentally, my son's working on his PhD down there on mule deer right now.
Really cool, really cool. You've worked as a biologist for the federal government, state wildlife agencies, universities, and in the private sector in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Jim has also authored and co-authored hundreds of scientific papers, book chapters, popular articles, and been in magazines. He is currently the chairman of the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Mule Deer Working Group, which is an awesome group that I got the fortune of talking to Jim a little bit coming back from the NWTF banquet, and they're doing some phenomenal stuff there. And we'll get more into that. Jim, you've also helped out with episodes on Leupold's Big Game Profiles. You've wrote scripts for Boone and Crockett Country, and then the Mule Deer Working Group helped produce the program Mule Deer Saving the Icon of the West. You're a professor of the University of Arizona, which, Jim, I have to say, of all of the things that you've got going for you, and then
You're least
obviously
impressed with that.
Everybody knows me as an ASU Sun Devil, so I had to give you a little bit of a hard time. But you are a professor, adjunct professor at the University of Arizona. You're a professional member of the Boone and Crockett Club, and you currently work as a wildlife science coordinator for the Arizona Game and Fish Department. With all that said, Jim, you have credentials that are unbelievable. You have a working background and knowledge. But the other thing I'd like to point out, Jim, is you're an active hunter. You enjoy hunting. I also noticed that you're into tactical firearms and a lot of handgun. You like to shoot handguns, in your off time and your spare time. You even compete, I think, on a level. So you're a gun owner, you're a hunter, and I'm really excited about having you on this podcast. Dar and I rode back on the same plane with you coming back from the NWTF convention, and it was great to finally meet you. I've read your book. Your website is deernut.com, and your book, Deer of the Southwest, was an awesome book, and I encourage any of the listeners out there to make sure they get that book. It's so comprehensive, talking about our deer. And Jim, I'm just excited to have you on the podcast.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here. Speaking of the book, the book's out of print. It was so wildly successful they sold out, and the reprint, the second printing, will be available in April, they tell me. So probably another 4 weeks or so, and that can be ordered on the website as well. But you forgot to tell them when we first met, when I walked on the bus and you saw my U of A logo, and you were expounding about what a fantastic university that was, and probably not only the best in the state, but one of the best in the nation. That's why I remembered that. Was that? Am I not remembering that correctly?
It's not quite how I remember it, but it's one of those things. I feel like it's a duty of mine as a Sun Devil to constantly, at any given chance that I can, give anybody that goes to the U of A or lives around the U of A, or quite honestly, anybody that drives by the U of A, I have to give them a hard time. I think that's just part of being a Sun Devil. But in all fun, it's a fantastic university, and we do like to have a lot of badgering back and forth, and that's kind of the fun of it. Jim, I'm super excited to have you on the podcast. One of the reasons is it's really nice to be able to talk to a wildlife biologist that has as much background as you do, and you obviously love deer. We're going to talk about wolf reintroduction and some of the wolf issues that Arizona's facing, as well as some of the states around the West here. But I first want to ask you about your love for deer, and you're obviously a hunter yourself. Where did the love for deer start with you?
Yeah, with a website named deernut.com, I think that probably says it all. And I've got another email address that's cervidnut. Of course, cervids are any member of the deer family. But I grew up in more of an urban environment in northern Illinois until I was in 8th grade, and my dad bought a hardware store in rural southern Wisconsin, and we moved to Wisconsin, and I started in school in 8th grade noticing that all my friends were talking about squirrel hunting and rabbit hunting, and I couldn't believe that their parents at 14 were letting them walk around the woods with a real shotgun. I mean, I grew up kind of a densely urban area, and so I started going out with them and started hunting, and then just caught the bug from there. And as I went to get my bachelor's degree in wildlife, because that's what I wanted to do in central Wisconsin at Stevens Point, I didn't want to be a deer biologist. I wanted to be something else. There was a lot of different deer biologists, and I didn't think we needed it anymore. And I fell into it in when I went on to graduate school and worked on trophy whitetails in South Texas and the effects of coyote predation on trophy whitetails, and then managed a ranch as the manager of wildlife operations in South Texas, where you wouldn't even tap your brakes if the buck was only 150 Boone and Crockett points, because it wasn't worth stopping and looking at. And that kind of environment really breeds some interest in certainly whitetails, and I went down the road of just loving deer. I eventually got to Arizona as a biologist and started flying helicopter surveys right away with the seasoned biologists, and we're flying up in whitetail country in southern Arizona, and one of the biologists would say, "Whoa, look at that toad, did you see that? Let's go back. And we'd go back and look at this buck, and it was like 110 points. I couldn't believe they turned a helicopter around for this tiny little whitetail. And so then I eventually saw my first big desert mule deer and fell in love with mule deer, and I've kind of focused a lot on mule deer since then. But I have an appreciation for our little whitetail, and I promise that we won't talk about the pronunciation of Elliot's last name. We can just kind of skip over that probably by now.
That's good stuff. Yeah, whether it's cows or coos, and we all know, and you can educate us, it's Elliot cows, but most of the coos deer hunters that I know call it coos, and so there's this if you're listening out there wondering what Jim's talking about, there's this whole different groups that, call them cows deer, which is actually the correct pronunciation, and then there's a bunch that say coos deer, and regardless of what you call them, they're fantastic deer. Jim, you would agree. And,
yeah.
The one question I would have if we're talking specifically about coos is, you have a lot of background with those southern, South Texas deer. From a biological standpoint, what would be the differences between coos deer and, say, a South Texas whitetail?
It's it's size, and the reason that there's such a size difference is that the little cow's whitetail and Elliot's last name was pronounced cows. If 90% of the people want to call it coos, I really could care less. The only thing I don't like is when someone starts talking about Elliot's last name is pronounced something else, coos or cows or something. It wasn't. It was cows, just like C-O-W-S, because as I say in my book, I talked to one of Elliot's great-grandnephews in Boston, and he assured me that from his Uncle Elliot, great-uncle Elliot on down, the families always pronounce their last name as cows, just like a bovine. So I would much rather pronounce it coos, because I think of these hunters talking loudly about all the cows that they've killed through the years, and the non-hunter overhearing that probably is not a great thing. But that, it's whatever's correct is correct, and I never flinch if someone says coos. I could care less. But we've actually done some genetic work and looking at South Texas whitetails, the Carmen Mountain whitetail, which is a whitetail that's in West Texas down into Coahuila in between, and then the cow's whitetail. And the cow's whitetail was fairly isolated down in the Sierra Madre during its whole evolution and development, and that's why it was developed as a smaller animal. It didn't have the genetic interchange and the movement among the other whitetails. It kind of just developed smaller down there because of the arid, less productive habitat compared to in South Texas, where there's so much high protein leguminous browse and 30 inches of rainfall in South Texas and such. So it's just a smaller southwestern adaptation to a less lush environment.
For sure. And then and I promise the listeners we're going to get into the wolf stuff, but I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's the croaky mule deer or croaky mule deer. Can you talk a little bit about
named after
those?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, named
talk
after
about
General
those
Crook. Yeah, the crook-eye mule deer is just a subspecies name for the southwestern, one of the desert subspecies. Now, there really isn't any difference between the desert subspecies, and I wrote a paper in 2000, a scientific paper that showed that crook-eye name was actually not valid because it was based on a specimen that was actually a whitetail mule deer hybrid. And according to the taxonomic rules, it invalidates that whole name, crook-eye. So you won't see anybody using that subspecies name anymore. But it originally designated this lighter in color, lighter in weight, kind of desert version of the mule deer, which in itself is pretty cool. But there's a Southern California, kind of southwestern Arizona mule deer that some people call a burrow deer, and designated as separate from a crook-eye, the other desert mule deer. None of that's really valid. We've got desert mule deer, and it gradually grades up through Prescott and central New Mexico up into a larger, darker, heavier Rocky Mountain mule deer.
And is that, in your opinion, why, like Boone and Crockett, doesn't have a distinction between, well,
mm-hmm. Yep.
In your mind, is that why they don't distinguish between the two, that it's still the same deer?
Yeah, because you can't draw a line anywhere. We can go up and look at those deer on the Kaibab, and we can go down south of Tucson and look at those mule deer, and boy, they look like different critters. You can tell if you see a head mount, a shoulder mount, you can tell exactly if it came from a desert area or a Rocky Mountain area, but there's no place you can draw a line in between there, and so that's problematic if you're going to designate record book categories. Not that all of the lines between the record book categories are clean, but you should have some kind of break at least, and not a continuous, what biologists call a cline, from kind of a desert mule deer to a bigger Rocky Mountain mule deer.
Okay, that's good stuff. And then before we get into the wolf stuff, I want to also ask you about you do actively shoot a lot of handguns, and you're really into target practicing and such, and even at a competitive level, I believe. Talk a little bit about your love for that.
Sure. Yeah. Years ago, and I don't know how I became interested in pistols, but working on probably a remote ranch in South Texas, I had a pistol and just started reading more about competition and started getting involved in some of the USPSA is one, United States Practical Shooting Association is one form of competitive shooting. International Defensive Pistol Association, IDPA, is another. I shoot both of those. There's a lot of different steel matches, Steel Challenge, and our local range in Tucson has the Steel Workers, and there's other matches up in Phoenix. Phoenix and Tucson have really been the national mecca for competitive shooters back in the 80s. Some of the big names really got started there, and a few of them are still shooting. But that's really my outside of wildlife management passion, and I try to shoot. I'll shoot competitively about once a week normally.
And that's your way of getting out, and that's kind of your hobby that you enjoy outside of your work that you can do, and you know it's something that you can do with on your own time, and you can also shoot competitively. Mm-hmm. Do you get just as much kick out of going out and practicing as you do as actual competing?
Yeah, I don't get a chance to go out and just practice per se, but I'll shoot local matches on the weekend and evening matches sometimes in Phoenix, which are just low key. I like that. It's just really fun to have some local shooting friends, the camaraderie. A lot of my shooting friends are not hunters. Some of them are. A lot of them are not hunters. And for me, my work is so intense. I work so hard. I work so much. It's fun for me to go to the range on the weekend, shoot a pistol match, and interact with a lot of people that aren't going to ask me why I didn't get drawn for elk, and we talk about guns and we shoot pistols, and it's kind of a fun other thing to do other than what I do 60 hours a week otherwise.
Sure. Well, that's awesome. Well, I want to dive into a subject that's oftentimes controversial. We're hearing quite a bit about it right now. To put a little context from where I come from, I'm actually up in Colorado right now, and my wife and I spend the summers up here, and we were actually up here doing a little bit of snow skiing, and in the Aspen airport, up on the wall are these kind of big murals, and it's Restoring Colorado's Natural Balance, and it's the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project.org. And, there's a picture of a wolf, and it's, did you know? And it says, for eons, wolves thrived throughout Colorado. Pioneers traveling westward into Colorado in the 19th century wrote in the journals about the howl of the wolf and the land-rich wildlife. And, then there's another one that says, however, in those days, progress meant taming the land and cleansing it of its predators. Wolves became the target of an extermination campaign. In 1945, the howl of the wolf was silenced in Colorado, and when the last one was shot, since then the wolf population in Colorado has stood at 0. Times have changed, and today we understand wolves better. After decades of successful wolf recovery in the West, isn't it time the wolf to roam Colorado's Rocky Mountains once again? With vast wildlands and abundant natural prey, western Colorado holds great promise for the wolf in the 21st century, yet wolves remain conspicuously absent from the wild and the scenic place. And basically then there was some pictures of wolves and what have you, and so here's a petition to the public to bring the wolves back again. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I come from a ranching background, a grandson of a rancher. I'm a sportsman, obviously. I'm a professional outfitter. I'm a guide. I love Arizona's, deer, elk, all of our big game animals. And, then we had the Mexican wolf reintroduction. We had the wolves up on the White Mountain Apache Indian Reservation. I'm just kind of paraphrasing. I'm sure you're cringing at all of these generalizations, but you can dive into it in a minute.
No, that's fine.
But I come from kind of a background of someone that lives in Arizona, someone that sees what went on in Yellowstone, someone that sees what all of the surrounding areas of, say, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and all of the repercussions of those wolves and how, in my mind, that population got out of control. There's so much politics to all of it. And then, boom, the reintroduction of the Mexican gray wolf in Arizona, and how a lot of people thought that this was a great idea. From my perspective as a sportsman and as a grandson of a rancher, I don't see the huge benefits of having a wolf, whereas, we have lots of coyotes and lots of other mountain lions and other predators. The wolf always seems like it's something that, comes into an area and over time ends up wiping out most of the deer, most of the elk, most of the moose. I had a friend, I was riding on a chairlift the other day, and he says, I went to here in Colorado, there was a guy that did a big presentation on wolves, and he said, I can't believe it, but I've always thought wolves were bad and they ate everything. But he pointed out that wolves are, not bad, and that they don't eat everything out of house and home. And I just flat looked at him on the chair and I said, we just need to agree to disagree on this, because from everything I've heard and seen, wolves that go left unmanaged, basically they eat every deer and elk and moose in the countryside. So with all that being said, I kind of want to set the stage of kind of how my attitude is towards wolves. And I'm curious, from someone, as you're a hunter yourself, you're a wildlife biologist, I'd like to have you educate me and the listeners a little bit on all of this wolf reintroduction, the Mexican gray wolf, speak to the Yellowstone stuff, kind of just give us, let's talk about it.
That's perfect. That was the absolute perfect foundation to jump off, and gave me an idea of how to maybe step through it a little more logically. So first, for everybody, and when you and I have just talked a little bit about wolves, we haven't even talked all that much about my past involvement and what I've been involved in. So let me lay that groundwork. I'm not involved in anything in Colorado. That's a concerted advertising campaign that started up about a year and a half ago, led, I believe, by Mike Phillips, the executive director of the of Turner Endangered Species Fund. And I say that because he told me and some other people that he was going to crank up a campaign to market wolves to Coloradans and get a groundswell of grassroots effort to support wolf recovery there. Not necessarily Mexican wolf recovery, but just, and he said that, not just Mexican wolf recovery, just wolves in general. So that what you're seeing the products of that advertising campaign. That I'm not involved in that at all, and really honestly haven't even kept track of that. But they've been having workshops and airport signs and TV commercials and all kinds of things, just to kind of warm Coloradans up for, or attempt to anyway, for wolves. So that's not my deal. What I've been involved in the last 7 years is working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, other experts, other state game and fish agencies, in trying to draft a recovery plan revision. So the Mexican wolves went extinct in the wild in about 1980. There weren't any in the wild. Before they went extinct, the Fish and Wildlife Service paid a trapper to go down into Mexico and see if he could trap a couple of wolves and bring them into captivity for a captive breeding program. And he was successful in trapping, I believe it was 5, and brought them into captivity. There was a few bona fide Mexican wolves in captivity that they added those to, and they started a captive breeding program that now numbers about 280 Mexican wolves in captivity, and they all originated from 7 individuals. So you might hear people talking about genetic diversity, and that's why all Mexican wolves on the planet come from 7 individuals. So they have all those wolves in captivity, in 1998 we started released 11 in Arizona, and that began the actual recovery into the wild. More recently, there's been some released in Mexico. But that began the reintroduction and recovery of Mexican wolves in the Southwest. A recovery plan was written in 1982, and recovery plans are supposed to set forth the thresholds of, okay, when we have this many wolves, we're going to consider those no longer in danger of extinction. We're going to take them off the endangered species list, and we're going to turn their management over to the states. That's what the Endangered Species Act is supposed to be. It's in fact not supposed to be an overarching long-term kind of management structure. It's supposed to be like an ICU. If you're in danger of dying, you go in the intensive care unit, they save you from dying. But once you're out of the woods and they save you from actually being in danger of dying, then you go to the hospital or you go home for more long-term care. And that's exactly what the Endangered Species Act is. It's just supposed to get the animals out of the ICU and turn their management over to state agencies. And as we've seen with a lot of species, there's some groups, mostly environmentally oriented groups, that want to use the Endangered Species Act as a tool to keep wolves listed forever and never fall into the evil hands of the state wildlife management agencies, which they don't trust because we actually hunt animals. And so my involvement in wolf recovery was to revise that 1982 recovery plan, because that didn't set forth any clear thresholds for when they would be taken off the endangered species list. And that's a problem. We were releasing wolves into the wild, and there was no clear end game for when they were going to be delisted. And so there was a push to try to revise that original 1982 plan that was really too vague to be useful, into something that actually had hard thresholds and said, when we have this number of wolves in these places, they come off the endangered species list, management's turned over to the state agencies, so we can manage wolves like we manage the prey animals. We need to manage predators just like we manage prey, and state agencies, frankly, manage a couple species of fox and coyotes and wolves and bears and other carnivores. There's no reason they shouldn't be managing wolves, so that's the goal. My role in wolf recovery and that of others from state agencies and a few other experts that were called in was to try to make sure the recovery of that, the revision of that recovery plan was done in such a way that it resulted in a reasonable course of action for the future, not a case where we were just going to craft some recovery criteria so that the wolves would never be delisted. And there were people involved in the process from academic backgrounds and maybe from some agency background, not from the state agencies, that really wanted the bar super high so it could never be reached. And so that began this struggle of 7 years that I was involved in, of battling with people with that kind of mindset to try to get a revised recovery plan that actually had some achievable and reasonable and pragmatic goals, that once they really were no longer in danger of extinction, they don't need to be protected by the Endangered Species Act anymore. They can move over to the states, and we can manage them at an appropriate level with complete public input, listening to all sides. And so that was my role in Mexican wolf recovery. What you hear, you mentioned Yellowstone, and actually should probably tell everybody that revised recovery plan was signed last November of 2017. The plan was signed. It does have some very reasonable thresholds of when we're going to consider wolves to be no longer in danger of extinction and turned over to the state. And those thresholds, in a nutshell, are 320 wolves in the U.S. and Arizona and New Mexico, and 200 wolves in Mexico. So two populations of those totaling 520. And that's the lower threshold. So there'll be more wolves than that. It's not like when we get to 321, we start hunting them. We need to make sure that we maintain at least that number, because that's the number we decided is the point where they're not in danger of extinction. And so we've got this plan, and it's a reasonable plan. It's well grounded in science. There's a lot of attacks on it right now by environmental groups that didn't get what they wanted. Of course, they wanted, as I mentioned, these incredible criteria that could never be reached. And I think what we've got is something that satisfies the legal and our requirements for the Endangered Species Act to bring those animals so they're not going to be extinct, but also is mindful of ranchers and hunters and other stakeholders that live and work on the landscape. We don't live in a pristine environment, and we can't let wolf populations just run unfettered to have a wolf decide how many are going to be out there. I mean, we've got to be able to maintain the wolf as a member of the southwestern group of wildlife that we have, but not be to the point where they're going to be causing unacceptable impacts to livestock operations, unacceptable impacts to our elk populations, which brings us to the Yellowstone issue. A lot of people point to Yellowstone and see how that elk population was devastated after they put wolves in there. And the environmental group, it's used by both sides of the argument. Some of the environmentalists and some of the uneducated public will say, look, we need to bring wolves back because look what they did in Yellowstone. We put them in there, and we've got more birds and butterflies and beavers, and the aspen are growing, and it just changed the course of rivers. If you've seen that YouTube video that's full of ridiculous errors, but the environmentalists say, look, we need wolves to restore the ecosystem. And they point to Yellowstone, and other people point to Yellowstone and say, well, look, at wolves devastated that elk population. We don't want wolves where we are. And as is often the case in nature, it's much more complicated than that. What happened in Yellowstone is they released the wolves. The wolves introduced this higher predation rate on elk, certainly, but the presence of wolves also brought the coyote population way down. So you had much less predation on some of the young fawns and the young calves by coyotes. So that was a counterbalancing effect. But more importantly, what happened for the next couple decades after wolves were released in Yellowstone was they had a series of dry summers that measurably decreased the elk recruitment into the elk populations. And there's so many people researching in Yellowstone that we've got good information on a whole bunch of different facets, and those summer droughts definitely decreased recruitment into the elk population. Also had those big fires in the late 1980s, which really dramatically changed that ecosystem before wolves were put in there. So there were changes of recovering from that. And we also had, during that time, we were harvesting cow elk because it was the only way we could manage the elk population in Yellowstone, not being able to hunt in Yellowstone. They were having a hunt in Montana right off the park boundary when those elk left in the winter to go down on winter range, and they'd harvest them with cow hunts after that. Well, they were doing surveys as this elk population was starting to decline because of that and changes in the habitat. And they were noticing this decline in elk population, but as they surveyed, it was hard to say whether they really got an accurate survey each year. They started to wonder if maybe the elk were going out farther on winter range and they just weren't catching them on the survey. And as a result, they kept the number of cow tags up, probably in retrospect higher than they should have. And so even the cow harvest on that elk population contributed to that decline in the overall elk population. So you had an elk population where they were surveying 17,000 elk, and then after 10 or 15 years, they were surveying, I think, about 4,000 elk off of that. But people point to that and say wolves did all that, but wolves didn't do all that. It was kind of a perfect storm of a lot of different factors affecting that elk population to cause that decline. And so there's no way you'd expect that same thing to happen in Arizona. We're not going to have wolf populations grow and grow and grow. And if you look, many people have probably seen that graph of that wolf population growth in Yellowstone. It was pretty incredible. It just went up and up and up. There were over, I think, at one point 113 wolves in Yellowstone, and then when that elk population went down, the number of wolves went way down with it. It was just kind of a classic peak and decline. But we wouldn't expect that same thing to happen in our working landscape in the Southwest as what happened in the national park that just had that number of factors that happened all at the same time.
Okay,
so
I hear what you're saying, but my question would be, you don't expect that to happen because of those several of factors, the fires and the over harvest of the cows by the hunters and what have you. But someone with the skeptical nature like I have is, well, what if it did happen, Jim? And what can the Arizona Game and Fish do to try and look at what's been done and try and mitigate or try and, make it not as, basically don't follow the same path that they followed before?
Yeah, those are the conversations we've been having for not all of the 7 years I've been involved, because the early parts were a little different. But the last 4 years or so that we've the state agency have been more involved. Those are the conversations we've had already, and that was the argument, and that was the fight to get recovery criteria to a point where they were reasonable. And so I've spent an awful lot of time over the last few years calculating ungulate biomass, how much wolf food we have out per square mile and out there in the Southwest, and how many wolves can that support. And it's a very tough thing to do, but I spent a lot of time looking at that from a lot of different angles. And with our threshold of 320, looking at all the information you can with the number of elk and deer that we've got out there, 320 wolves shouldn't impact that. That should not be a level where it impacts elk population significantly. And so when we were building those thresholds in, we were already thinking about what are we going to do to make sure that doesn't happen what happened in Yellowstone. We're able to implement some management, and in the recovery plan it talks about once you get over that threshold in the mid 350, 380, you can start implementing some management on the wolves. If it's seriously impacting an elk population, there are tools like part of the Endangered Species Act has a thing called a 4D rule as part of it that allows you to set up an area, and if you can show the wolves are really impacting elk populations, you can actually, first we would be removing wolves probably and taking them to the other recovery area in Mexico if that wasn't recovered yet. But you can remove wolves, and and that can be lethal, and it can be just through translocation. So in this revised plan, we've built in safeguards so that the wolf population is not just going to run amok in Yellowstone and increase. And part of that was litigation too in Yellowstone. The original Yellowstone recovery criteria were 3 populations of 100. And then shortly after that, I don't know the details of why, but they got together and they decided to move it to 3 populations of 150 each. Well, it was those 3 populations combined were 1,700 wolves before Congress delisted it, because every time the Fish and Wildlife Service tried to delist them, the environmental groups would sue and find a sympathetic judge to get them relisted on the endangered species list. And that same thing has happened in the Midwest, and the same thing will happen in the Southwest with Mexican wolves. When we hit those recovery criteria and move to delist wolves, environmental groups will sue and looking for loopholes and looking for details that they can try to convince a judge that they're not, in fact, out of the woods yet, and we need to keep them on the endangered species list. And we just have to fight those fights. There's no way you can prevent that. Those groups are always going to sue to keep wolves listed. They always have. But
and
the plan that we've
one
got,
of my biggest worries is that, what you're telling me is wolves are here in Arizona, and it was set forth in 1982, and what you guys did is made a recovery plan to try and, in essence, keep that in check. So,
yeah, we're not having a discussion anymore about whether we're going to recover Mexican wolves in the Southwest. That bus left the station a long time ago. We have an obligation to recover all native species, and all sportsmen, myself included. I've written book chapters and magazine articles and even scientific papers bragging about hunters have been the forefront of wildlife conservation and population and species restoration in the Southwest. We're hunters, and we like to say hunter-conservationists because we're the true conservationists that really saved all these large mammals, whereas Europe lost a lot of theirs. And we as sportsmen were at the forefront of saving those animals. And I don't think hunters want to be at the forefront of saying, well, we just want to save the ones that we want to hunt. We just want to save the ones that we eat. Either we're conservationists and we're going to conserve native wildlife and restore native wildlife, or we're not. I personally don't think that the future of hunting is in a good position if hunters in mass come out and say, we just want to save the animals that we hunt and we don't want to save our competitors.
Okay, so in essence what you're saying is, Jay, don't be ignorant. Wolves are here. What you would tell me personally is, Jay, wolves are here. What I'm trying to do and what the Game and Fish is trying to do is put together a plan that we can manage these. We know that we're going to face opposition, and we know that we're going to face lawsuits and what have you from the environmentalist side and what have you. But, obviously you can't speak for Arizona Game and Fish, but in essence, you're trying to say we're trying to make the best of what's already happening.
Yep. Yeah, in that respect, I certainly do speak for the department because that's what we've all been working on. And in being involved in this recovery plan and not letting some preservation-minded people take it and run with it, which frankly is what happened several times. Our effort to revise that recovery plan was the fourth effort to revise a recovery plan. The first couple, not always because of disagreements, sometimes because of legal reasons. The other recovery plans were not successful, the other recovery teams were not successful in doing that. And I was placed on the third recovery team to craft a meaningful recovery plan in 2010, and that started my involvement. And I was the odd man out. There was 8 other scientists on that recovery team, and I was the only one battling for reasonable and achievable recovery criteria. Everybody else was arguing for all kinds of complicated recovery criteria that would result in wolves permanently being on the endangered species list. So I was in the trenches, and after 2 years of my viewpoint really just being rolled over and ignored, in December of 2012, after 2 years of that, I resigned from the recovery team and resigned with not only a resignation letter, but about a 14-page report pointing out all the scientific flaws in process and science in the way they were headed. And when I did that in December of 2012, the recovery team, they had a meeting scheduled, so they met one more time, but that was it. They were put on the back burner. I believe because the flaws that I pointed out were serious flaws that they couldn't continue through after I pointed them out publicly. And actually, that report I think still resides on the Arizona Game and Fish website for anybody to look at. Although most of those things that were flaws at that time we've worked through and improved. But just to give you a background of where how long I've been battling for, just as you say, wolves are being recovered, and Arizona Game and Fish supports wolf recovery, but supports wolf recovery only in a way where we're set forth some reasonable criteria to get them off the endangered species list, and we have some safeguards built in to make sure that they're not just running unfettered in as many wolves as some of the other groups want out there.
So it had to feel a little bit like you were the lone, it's kind of a funny use of words, but you were the lone wolf in essence in fighting against these others.
I actually have a T-shirt that says "One Man Wolf Pack," and that was kind of the joke that I was a one-man wolf pack back then. But I was going to say, when we would do doodle polls to get the next recovery team meeting together, I would actually sign it instead of my name. If most listeners know what a doodle poll is, online to schedule a meeting, I would, instead of sign my name, I would sign -1, because the rest of the recovery team started writing documents to say that the recovery team feels, and then in parentheses they would put -1, that was me, who disagreed with everybody. And I wrote 3 different long, detailed scientific dissenting opinions throughout that whole process about how we were headed in the wrong direction as a team. It was a real difficult time because I saw a lot of strong personalities that were 100% preservation minded and did not have people living on the ground in mind with the kind of things they were suggesting. And so it was pretty tough for me to battle against some very intelligent and very nice people I enjoy spending time with, as long as we're not talking about wolf recovery. But it was a difficult time for me, and really the process that we went through in the last 3 years, where the Fish and Wildlife Service set that team aside, didn't use them as a team anymore. They invited some of those experts to the table over the last couple of years to help draft the revised recovery plan, but they weren't in the driver's seat. They were advisors to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they invited the 4 southwestern state agencies, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, to the table to also be advisors. And it was then, when you had a more balanced representation, when we got an actual recovery plan that the Fish and Wildlife Service could with a straight face sign off on and know that this is a recovery plan to get them off the endangered species list, but it's not a plan to keep them on there forever.
When you, I just want to go back to a couple of things you said. When you said it's 520 wolves total, 320, I believe you said, in the U.S., 200 in Mexico. Did I understand you correctly to say 320 in the U.S.?
Yes, and split between Arizona and New Mexico, and so that's all Arizona and New Mexico from the Mexican border up to I-40. In what we call the 10J area, which is actually the area where we're recovering wolves, but it's all south of I-40, not in southern Colorado like some groups have wanted. And really, when you look at, and I have this gigantic spreadsheet that if you could print it out in a plotter, it would be like a tablecloth, and it's all tiny numbers where I calculated number of elk, number of mule deer, number of whitetail in each game management unit, converted that to pounds of ungulates, pounds of prey, converted that to pounds of edible prey, did calculations with how much meat each wolf would eat in a year, and did, like I say, the spreadsheet's gigantic, and it's full of those kind of calculations. And any way you look at it, 300, 400 wolves is not going, it doesn't look like it's going to depress elk populations. We've got productive enough elk populations that every different way you can calculate that, the number of territories we have, the number of packs we have, how many elk a pack will eat during the year, it's hard from a meat perspective to show elk populations dramatically from a statewide perspective being impacted. Now, in some areas like Unit 1 and 27 over by Alpine, eastern Arizona, there's no evidence that the elk population's affected yet, but you could get, like they did in Montana, there's a Lolo herd that decreased dramatically, and some people felt was elk predation doing that, and I'm not sure if that actually was the case, but you could certainly get some hot spots where wolves are depressing.
Wolf predation,
yes.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Wolf predation on elk. And so we could get some areas in the Southwest, certainly a few game management units where we have a high density of wolves. We could have them after a series of years decrease the elk population locally in those areas. So it's not like wolves aren't going to affect elk anywhere, but we've got things built into this plan that if you can demonstrate that the elk population is declining dramatically in the face of and because of wolf predation, then we can do different management. We can have management there. We can pull wolves out of there. When we get enough wolves, we can remove wolves even before they're taken off the endangered species list. You know, I knew a biologist in Idaho that was authorizing a lot of wolf killing when they were still listed up there in the northern Rockies. So you can kill wolves while they're still listed, but it has to be done under certain rules of the Endangered Species Act. We do have tools where we can manage wolves. It's not just hands off until they're completely delisted. And I was talking to David Meach, who arguably the most famous wolf guy anywhere, and I talked to him a lot during this process, and he's always been very, very much for a practical management of wolves. He's got a good pragmatic approach to wolf recovery. In fact, he wrote a paper once where he said that if the wolf advocates or wolf activists would agree to non-government control of wolves, which in a way is hunting, we could have more wolves in more places if people didn't just demand that it was only government and there was no hunting. So he's got a very pragmatic approach at it, and he told me when we were talking about 200 wolves up in Arizona, New Mexico, 300 wolves, he said, "Well, do you have coyotes up there?" I said, "Yeah, we got a lot of coyotes all over there." He says, "Well, if you think about it, the Mexican wolf is just a little bit bigger than a coyote, and a coyote will eat everything his size and smaller, and a Mexican wolf can eat everything from about elk size down to a mouse size." And so there's a lot of alternative prey out there for a carnivore, like a Mexican wolf, which isn't like a big Canadian wolf. It's just a little bit bigger than a coyote. So it helped me kind of think about our landscape probably could support some 60 to 80 pound carnivores out there. A lot more than you would think. Sometimes some people think 300, wow, that's a lot of wolves. But right now we have 114 in that area and not seeing any impacts. And there's a whole bunch of country where there aren't even any wolves yet. And we're not even seeing impacts where there are fairly dense populations of wolves. So I think we can have a lot more wolves than we kind of think we can before we start seeing impacts.
Let's hope you're right, Jim. Let's hope you're right. Couple questions. One would be, when those Mexican gray wolves were first introduced back into Arizona, were they introduced on the White Mountain Apache Indian Reservation, or where were the transplant sites or reintroduction sites?
I wasn't involved back then, and I don't remember exactly where the site was, but I don't think it was on the White Mountain. I don't think we started on tribal lands, but I just don't remember off the top of my head where those release locations were.
Okay, and then from your studies, you said it goes to I-40 to the north. So you're telling me that yes, Jay, for sure there are cases where there were wolves, all the way up to I-40. So this isn't a line that you had to go, well, okay, I'll give in to that. I mean, there were proven cases that Mexican gray wolves existed up to the I-40 line?
That's about the best line because, and that's good we talk about historical range. There were wolves all over, but if you look at the historical records, and I don't know if I wrote a manuscript on the historical range of the Mexican wolf, and I had to do that because a lot of people were arguing, well, Mexican wolves, they went up into Colorado and Utah, so we should use Colorado and Utah for recovery areas, and they didn't. And I argued that in all of my time on the recovery team and realized I just needed to write a scientific paper and get it in the scientific literature. And so I teamed up with two other co-authors. One is Ron Nowak, and he was he spent his whole career in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he started measuring canine skulls, wild canine skulls, in the late 1960s for his PhD, and he is hands down the world's expert in canid physical morphology, like measuring skulls and determining subspecies and species, and whether something has some hybridization in it. The guy's a world-renowned expert. If you Google his name on Amazon, he's written all kinds of mammals of the world, and he's just an amazing resource for that. So he was one co-author to deal with the physical morphology analysis. The other co-author was David Patkow, who's the president of Wildlife Genetics International in British Columbia, and a well-known, well-published wildlife geneticist who owns his own company. He's done thousands of wildlife genetics studies through that company. So I had a morphologist, a guy that was an expert in the physical part. I was really familiar with the historical literature, and we had a geneticist who was real familiar with handling his genetic material. And we wrote a scientific paper on the historical range and documented very well what all of the old historians and naturalists always said, is that the Mexican wolf was a wolf that was in the Sierra Madre of Mexico and dispersed and lived in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. That was the historical range of the Mexican wolf. But if you look at skull measurements and historical reports about wolves up on the Mogollon Rim in central Arizona and the Gila National Forest in central New Mexico, those wolves in that central Arizona and New Mexico were intermediate in size between a big plains wolf that was up on the Kaibab in northern Arizona, northern New Mexico, between those big northern wolves in the northern part of our states, and the Mexican wolf in Mexico in the southern part of our states. That middle Mogollon Rim and Gila National Forest was a blending, an intermediate, where Mexican wolves dispersed up in there, and also the larger wolves dispersed south from the southern Rockies and from the Kaibab and from the south rim of the Grand Canyon. And so that really was a blending zone in there, and those wolves being part Mexican wolf, part northern wolf in the intergrade. And so that's why Fish and Wildlife Service, when they were starting the recovery in the 90s, they looked at some of the same information and saw that that was an intermediate zone, and because there was elk there, decided to use all of that intermediate zone as part of Mexican wolf range to focus their recovery in there. And a good part of it because there's a big block of of habitat with a lot of ungulates there. And our agency and nobody really has complained about that slight stretch to include the Mogollon Rim for wolf recovery, because they had to start somewhere. And the Sky Islands are pretty small and dispersed. It'd be hard to focus wolf recovery in an area like that. And that was legitimately a place where Mexican wolves dispersed up into and occupied and blended with the northern wolves. So I've never had a complaint with that expansion. But in my time on the recovery team, a lot of those other people were talking about, well, they're on the rim now, and so we should, they could easily disperse into southern Colorado. They could easily disperse to the Kaibab Plateau, so we should just include the Kaibab and southern Colorado as their range. And I told them that was a ridiculous argument, because if that was how you were going to define where to put wolves, you could keep leapfrogging all the way up to the Arctic Circle with Mexican wolves. And so this paper that I wrote defining the historical range was to try to put a stop to that and try to document Mexican wolves were in Mexico, southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, and they integrated with a larger wolf in the central part of those states. And so when we talk about recovering wolves, Mexican wolves, where else are we going to put them? A lot of groups are still arguing, in fact there's 2 lawsuits right now, arguing that they need to go in southern Utah and in southern Colorado. And that's not an ecologically valid or a legally valid argument. They need to go in Mexico. That's why we call them Mexico wolves. 90% of their historic range was in Mexico. Why would you not focus at least half of the recovery in Mexico?
And that brings up another subject that kind of makes me smile, because I've been going down to Mexico for 20 years and hunting Coues deer and Gould's turkeys down there, and just love hunting in Mexico. And I've probably have met, I'm going to say, over 50 different ranchers in Mexico, and I find it hard to believe, now this is just me speaking kind of outside the realm of, it's just kind of what I've encountered. I find it hard to believe that any one of the Mexican ranchers that I've met, if they had Mexican wolves on their property, would not try and extinct and shoot those wolves. I'm not speaking to anyone specific. I'm just speaking in general terms. How does it, I would think it would be a challenge for the Mexican government to be involved. I'm curious how they are involved in the recovery process, and how, since in Mexico landowner and ranchers are king, literally, how they're going to, we have public
how it's
lands
going to work
here
in Mexico,
in the United,
right?
Yeah, we have public lands in Arizona, and pretty much everything in Mexico is private land. Not only that, most of the ranchers that actually own ranches there are, of the most wealthy families with the most power and pull, if you will, politically. I kind of chuckle, because I hear all of what you're saying, and I really appreciate the work that you've done. It sounds like you're the only one that's been, basically batting for trying to keep all this in balance. But I think it's going to be a challenge in Mexico. How is it going? Do you know?
Yeah, it will be a challenge in Mexico. It's a challenge anywhere, and Mexico carries with it its own difficulties. But we have they get signed agreements from landowners for certainly releasing wolves and in areas where wolves are going to occupy. And so they have, I don't know how many they have now. I've heard, but this is old information, a year and a half old, that they had 7 or 11 landowners that had signed agreements. And there's Mexican biologists that have been working for a couple decades on Mexican wolf habitat analysis and trying to get Mexican wolves on the ground. And they began in 2011 releasing wolves in Mexico. The first release was in an area that was not in any of the areas that any of the biologists in U.S. or Mexico identified as good Mexican wolf habitat. There was some political wrangling because someone wanted them released on their ranch, I think, and it was not good habitat. They released them in the middle of a heavily dominated agricultural area where everybody's raising livestock, and within the first month or so, 5 out of the 6 of them were poisoned. And everybody was kind of mad because that was not a good area to release them. And I don't know what happened I don't know what happened to make that precipitated that release site. But the subsequent releases, and they've released, I don't know how many other releases of wolves, pairs here and there, have been more in the higher elevation areas where the primary production is timber, not livestock, which seems like a no-brainer. And they're releasing it on areas, ranches and areas where they have agreement from the people that support wolves. And one of the biologists I'm working with was just telling me that one of the places down there where they're releasing wolves, or someone he met years ago that came to him because he found out he's working on wolves, and this rancher wanted wolves. He was very conservation oriented, wanted wolves on his place, and said, why can't we use my place for releasing wolves? And fast forward, it was about 10 years later, I think, that he actually is one that has wolves on his place now. So it's definitely not going to be easy, but there's people that are supportive of wolf recovery, and they're working with those people. And Mexican biologists like Carlos Lopez Gonzalez, who's a professor down at the University of Querétaro, and he's worked with carnivores and Mexican wolves his whole career, probably close to 30 years now, at least 20. I've known him for 25 years. So he's been working on wolves a long time, and he has a crew of people out there, and they're out there day in and day out talking with the ranchers. They know the ranchers, and working with, and they're able to navigate a lot of the drug cartel lands down there and be able to operate in there. They've been pretty successful. There's about 30 wolves in the wild in Mexico. There's one pair that has produced litters in the wild the last 4 years in a row. So there's challenges, but I'm not sure Mexico's doing any worse than we did in the White Mountains for the first 5 or 10 years when we had so many of them shot and initially. So it's going to take just continued work with the landowners. But when we had a series of 6 workshops in the last 2 years, well, now 3 years, we had 4 of them in the U.S. and 2 of them in Mexico. And at a couple of those, we had high-ranking Mexican officials at the meeting talking about how important Mexican wolves were. We had Pepe Bernal, who is the head of endangered species in Mexico, and he stood up at one of our meetings and told us that Mexico endangered species has 3 priorities: the monarch butterfly, the vaquita, which is a little dolphin in the Sea of Cortez, and the Mexican wolf. And that was their priorities, and they wanted to work on those 3 species. Now, funding for the last year in Mexico was really cut for Mexican wolves, and so they don't always have the funding, or for whatever reason choose not to have the funding where it needs to go. But the Mexico, the recovery team down there that's working with radio-collared wolves in Mexico has gotten funding, has continued to operate in there, and they have more releases planned for this year. So it's tough. There's a lot of challenges down there, but they're struggling like we struggled when we only had a handful of wolves on the landscape and they kept getting shot.
You brought up something that leads me to another question of the Mexican wolf recovery. Where does the money come from to implement this recovery?
Yeah, a good part of it just comes from the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're the agency that's responsible for implementing the Endangered Species Act. And so most of the funding comes from there. Arizona Game and Fish has 5 positions. I think only 4 of them are filled right now, but we have 5 paid positions working on Mexican wolf recovery and have people dedicated to that. We have wolf biologists. We have someone else who's in charge of an what we call the IFT, interagency field team, and that's a field team with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Arizona Game and Fish. New Mexico Department of Game and Fish used to be part of that. They're not currently. They may in the future, but they have the different agencies working together as one team on the ground with wolves in Arizona and New Mexico to keep wolves radio collared. They just had a capture, like they do every February, a capture and account to get an annual survey of the wolves, and to radio collar a lot of young ones from last year, because it's important. We've got about half of the Mexican wolf population radio collared in Arizona and New Mexico, and that's important because we need to keep close tabs on them and monitor them closely so we know if they're increasing in distribution, so we can follow them up and see how many wolves are in each pack. We can follow them up and see what kind of reproduction they had. estimate mortality. It's just important right now to keep close tabs on them, and we are. It's pretty intensive management.
Are you familiar with the wolves that are collared, and are you familiar enough with it to know how are they doing and what are they primarily feeding on? Is there any way to know, you know, and what are those effects, you know, on elk and deer, and you know, what's going on with the coyotes and the mountain lions in the same place where the wolves are? I know that's a bunch of questions all in one, but, you know, talk a little bit about that.
Sure, I can probably knock the last part out pretty easy, that we haven't done intensive studies where we have collared lions and collared coyotes and collared wolves where we know much about that interaction. I suspect, just from what we know about wolves being recovered in other places, that in the areas where we have a dense presence of wolves, I can almost guarantee you the coyote population is quite a bit lower, because they're just not very tolerant. Wolves are not very tolerant of coyotes in their territory. So I'm sure where we've got the densest wolf pack occupancy, we've got lower coyotes. Not sure about mountain lions. I'm not sure if anybody knows that much about that interaction. Is not as direct as coyotes for sure, but we probably don't know much about mountain lion and wolf interactions. How the population's doing, the since 2009. Well, let me back up. I can actually give a little history about when we recovered wolves. The population increased pretty dramatically. There were some early mortalities. We got to 2003, and that population increase was starting to raise the ire of ranching community. They're starting for the first time to see some losses of cattle, and they were starting to exert some influence that looked like the Mexican wolf program, the recovery program, might be in jeopardy. Like if complaints reached the level of the legislature and legislature wanted to act, they could defund the Mexican wolf program at the national level. And we didn't want that to happen, and so we decided that we being everybody, all the agencies involved, be more aggressive in taking care of problem wolves that preyed on livestock. And so from 2003 to 2009, we had a little different tact and way to deal with problem wolves, more removing them quicker, dealing with problem wolves a little faster, not letting them out there on the landscape to keep preying on cattle. And for that period of 2003 to 2009, the growth of the Mexican wolf population stopped. It just flatlined and didn't continue to grow. And this is a wolf recovery project, and so when it flatlines for that number of years, that's not good. You're not recovering wolves if that's your goal, and it certainly was. So in 2009, there was a court injunction forcing the agencies to stop being so aggressive on problem wolves. And so since 2009, and we still take care of problem wolves, periodically there's a wolf that has 3 strikes, and so it's removed, a lot of times removed lethally, because it's a chronic problem wolf. And you have to do that in wolf recovery, or you lose all credibility and support for the whole program, and things can be even worse. So since 2009 to the present, the Mexican wolf population's increased on the average of 14% per year. Not exactly 14% every year, but on the average, it's recovered. So the wolf population recovery is doing well. This year's survey found 114 wolves, which is only one more than last year's count of 113. But overall, from 2009 to the present, you can't argue that we're slowly getting Mexican wolves back onto the landscape, which is our goal of recovery.
And is that 114 in Arizona or 114 in Arizona and New Mexico?
It's 14% for the Arizona and New Mexico population, for the U.S. population.
Oh, okay, a 14% increase. But how many
14% increase.
How many wolves do we think are alive in Arizona, and how many in New Mexico?
I don't know that breakdown. There's 114 in both states combined, and it's pretty close to 50-50. It's always like 40-60, one way or another. There's a couple of packs that go back and forth across the border, but they've always stayed pretty close to even number on both sides.
Okay, so for the 320 in the U.S., we're still, say, 200, give or take, shy of what the recovery goal and plan would be.
Yeah, we're still 200 shy of what would be the minimum number you'd have to maintain them above to say that they're no longer in danger of extinction, take them off the list.
Okay, and so even though a 14% increase, I guess you could say that they're not overpopulating very fast, and so I might have before this conversation said, oh yeah, they mate like rabbits, and they're going to be everywhere really quickly. The reality is they were introduced in 1982, and they've just slowly built to 114, right?
Yeah, introduced in 98. Yeah, the 82 was the recovery plan when that was written, but okay. So the 98 they were released for the first time. So from 98 to the present, we have 114. Yeah,
so in 20 years we have 114. Is that 114 or 114 pairs?
No, 114 wolves.
Okay.
Yeah, we have 22. This year's survey, we had 22 wolf packs in Arizona and New Mexico combined, and we had potential of 26 pairs. Well, we have 26 pairs that are potential breeders going into this breeding season this year.
And if you say looked another 20 years into the future, if the conditions, if everything in the last 20 years remained the same, that would put us at, basically 228 or 230 wolves. I've got to think the next 20 years, the recovery efforts the wolves will actually beat that number. In other words, it would surprise me if in 10 years we didn't get another 114. What's your thought?
Very possible. Right. Yeah, absolutely, because it's an exponential growth. They don't grow on this flat line. If you think of it as a graph, they don't grow on this flat, steady, increasing line. It's an exponential growth. So wolves in other places, they hit a point where all of a sudden they're dispersing and starting new packs, and they can grow fast. And that was the center of our conversation over the last couple of years, is that they're growing pretty well, and we're going to hit a point where there's going to be a lot of Mexican wolves out there, and we need to have this plan in place and be prepared to deal with that. So we don't have 1,700 wolves before Congress delists them.
Okay, and that's my biggest concern, and I think I'm sure it's your biggest concern as well. So with that being said, if someone out there says, oh, that Heffelfinger, he's just a wolf lover, he just wants wolves everywhere, your argument would be actually whether or not you like wolves. I don't really care about that part. My part is, no. I was part of writing the wolf recovery plan, and I'm speaking for you, Jim, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. I'm the one that wants to make sure that if we get over this 320, that we have checks and balances in place so that we can actually manage these wolves. I, Jim Heffelfinger, am not one that want to see these get to 1,700 and out of control like they did in Yellowstone.
Yep, that's absolutely true, and that's what I've been working an awful lot on in the last 7 years. I do like wolves. I think it would be so cool to be out with my son turkey hunting on the edge of a meadow and calling and have this pack of wolves, 5 or 6 wolves, come trotting through the meadow. I think that's just really cool. I would just love to hear wolves howl when I'm camped up there at Big Lake. I think that's really neat to have them on the landscape, but we need to manage all wildlife species, and there's no one species like wolves that is so important we're going to put it on a pedestal and let it damage or impact all the other native wildlife species that everybody else likes to see. Whether you hunt or not, even the wolf lovers like to go up and camp and see elk when they're up there. And so we absolutely want to return them to the southwestern landscape, but in a way that they're balanced, and not being able to manage them, not being able to control them at all is not going to create balance. It's going to create havoc, and we know that, and we've worked hard to have recovery criteria that, and not only I talk a lot about recovery criteria that's reasonable, but what's more important is as we were building the recovery criteria, it was important, and we worked really hard to build a good, solid scientific foundation to defend those criteria we use, so that when we get some wolves and maybe we want to delist wolves and some environmental groups come and start attacking, well, that recovery criteria is not very good because of this and that. We want to be able to show, trot out our science and say, no, look, this is a solid science supporting these recovery criteria that would make it a lot harder for environmental groups to try to poke holes in it and try to keep them on the endangered species list. So what you said before is just exactly right. I've been working my butt off for a lot of years now to help recover the Mexican wolf, because it's a native species and I think it belongs back on the landscape, but doing it in such a way that it's not going to impact our elk herds like we saw in Yellowstone for fairly different reasons. We just want them back on the landscape. We want a lot of elk. I just about only put in for cow elk tags. And so when I was on the recovery team, I mentioned that, well, we can't have our elk populations cut in half, and some of the other people on the team said, why not? You guys have got too many elk. That's why you have cow tags. That's not where we're going with this. My dad's 84 and I've got 4 sons, and we absolutely love going out and getting a couple cows in the freezer, cow elk in the freezer. And so I'm not advocating for replacing cow tags with wolf predation, but I think there's certainly room for still a lot of cow tags where we need to reduce elk populations and still have wolves in a managed situation on the landscape.
So you would say to rednecks like me and some of the people that listen to my podcast that, hey guys, I'm on your side, but I feel like after talking to you, Jim, it's like, man, Jim's actually, if we lost Jim in this fight, or if we lost Jim where he doesn't have an input on this recovery program, it could have been left in the hands of some of these, very one-sided leaning groups, and we could be in a completely different situation than we are now. I
think we would have been, yeah.
Okay. So,
and I don't want to sound self-aggrandizing, but my agency was forward-thinking enough that I was a regional biologist in Tucson and did nothing but game management. I just decided how many tags to put out. I'm just dealing with all hunting, running check stations, and trying to provide as much hunting opportunity as possible, provide some trophy opportunities. That's what I did for 23 years. And the last couple of years of that, I was involved in this wolf recovery, and they needed me when wolf recovery planning ramped up again. My agency needed me to go back into helping with wolf recovery, and they were forward thinking enough to establish a new position, wildlife science coordinator, that got me out of my day-to-day, all of my onerous regional biologist duties, and it put me in a position where I could help lead this effort, pull the science together, and we've written several scientific papers that support all of the things I'm talking about today of managing wolves responsibly. And I was able to kind of lead and shepherd other people in pulling all the science together to try to make sure we had the most reasonable, practical wolf recovery plan. So I'm just thankful my agency saw that as important enough to put me in a position where I had time to do that.
And so, with that being said, too, I mean, guys like myself should realize that, hey, the Arizona Game and Fish could have done things a lot differently. We better be happy that we have guys like Jim, and we have guys at the Arizona Game and Fish that allowed Jim to be in the position that he's in, to do what he's doing, to make sure that we did sound science. We based the recovery plan off of real sound platform or base, if you will, so that when the time comes, which we all know it will come, that it's based on really strict science, that when the environmental groups come to try and say, we don't want you to delist them, that there will be a baseline or a plan in place that will allow sound science to fight some of that emotionalism, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Just as one pointed example of the previous team that I was on and some of the things I was battling, they constructed one criteria, which means and one of many. They had a whole bunch of criteria. One criteria they were going to go with that I opposed and wrote a dissenting opinion against. One criteria was that we need to document a certain number of wolves entering each of 3 different wolf populations in the Southwest. At least 2 wolves every 8 years entering each of those 3 populations in order to make sure we had enough genetic diversity. And so this is all kind of a black box, hocus pocus, just in order to have genetic diversity. And how are we going to measure and prove that 2 wolves in the last 8 years entered each one of the 3 populations they set up? That's an example of a recovery criteria that they were using that you would never be able to document and thus never be able to delist the wolf. They had these complicated recovery criteria, and so when you see our recovery criteria of a certain number of wolves, and we also have another criteria that a certain number of new individuals need to be introduced into the population, which we propose to do with cross-fostering, which is taking very newborn, within 9 days or so, captive wolf pups and putting them into a den with newborn wild wolf pups. And the wild mother raises those extra 2 pups with her 4 pups as if they were hers. And so you have 6 pups. 2 of those actually were hand-selected pups from captivity with valuable genetic material that now are just raised in the wild and don't get into trouble because they're wild wolves. So it's an example of the way that we propose and are actively doing that successfully, introducing new genetic material. Whereas other people, environmental groups and some people in academia, their solution is just to open the floodgates and release a bunch of captive raised adult wolves, basically zoo animals, out into the wild, where we know from history they get in trouble, they get killed, they get hit on the highway, they come up and attack someone's dog and they get shot. They have to be lethally removed from the wild by the Fish and Wildlife Service because they're getting into trouble. And so there's a lot of things we built into the recovery planning to reduce the impact of wolves, but still fulfill our desire and I think our obligation to return Mexican wolves to the Southwest.
Jim, I really appreciate being in your ear on this episode, and I want to give you a chance, if you had any concluding thoughts in regards to anything we talked about today. I want to thank you for your time, and I want to thank you for all the work that you've done for sportsmen. It sounds like, I've really learned a lot today, and I hope the listeners have too. I'm somewhat wrestling with some of my own formulations in my head of, some of the prior concepts that I had about wolves, and so I'll need to do some thinking, but I want to give you a chance to you have any concluding thoughts about anything we've discussed today?
I can leave you with a quote from David Meach that I mentioned. That he's been working on wolves for 60 years. I know it sounds strange, but he actually has been working on wolves for 60 years. And he spoke at the University of Arizona once, and also has this in a manuscript of his. But he told everybody in the audience that those who think that the Mexican wolf not the Mexican wolf in general, but those who think returning the wolf to the wild is going to create some kind of utopian fantasy land where the birds and the butterflies and the beavers and the willows all recover and live in harmony. He says that's more of a religion than it is real science. But he says also, he's quick to add that those people that think that returning the wolf to our landscape are just going to decimate all the big game herds across the West. That also is more religion than it is science. But the reality is that we can restore wolves, and in a lot of cases, not really even see an impact on some of the ungulate populations, and maybe we will see an impact in some areas on ungulate populations. But we've got tools in place to deal with those local spots. But because one local elk herd may be impacted by a high density of wolves isn't a reason to oppose wolf recovery, across the West. I think we've got the future of hunting. This is probably the more important point to leave you with. The future of hunting is going to rely on how the average person views hunters and hunting and our intention. And we're at about 5% of the people that hunt. So of those other 95% of the people that don't hunt, how do they view hunting? Do they view hunting as contributing to conservation and things they're interested in, or not? And most of those people really think wolves are cool. Now, sure, they all live in an urban environment. They don't have to deal with any of the consequences or anything negative about wolves, but still, it doesn't matter. A majority of the public likes wolves, and they like the idea of wolves being returned. And so I don't think it serves sportsmen in the future hunting very well to position themselves on the other side of the table and say, we don't want wolves. We don't want any wolves back. I think we need to be reasonable about it and support wolf recovery in areas, but only in a situation where we've done our due diligence and doing everything we can to make sure that wolves are managed just like overabundant elk populations are managed. And I guess I'll leave with that.
Good stuff, man. Thanks so much for your time, and thank you for all the work that you've done. And I admire, I'm happy that your book, Deer of the Southwest, is being reprinted, and I know it was such a popular hit. I want to encourage the listeners to go check Jim out at deernut.com. Also, I enjoy following your Instagram, and I believe that's jim.deer. Jim.deer. It's Deere, like John Deere, but it's Jim Deere.
And you might notice the avatar. I changed that to a mule deer too, instead of the John Deere whitetail.
I did. I just looked at it, and it's got the G2. It's got the fork of a mule deer. I love it.
Yeah, fork G2, and then I had to go back in and shorten the tail. I forgot to shorten the tail the first time, but yeah, absolutely. Jim Deere on Instagram.
That's awesome. Jim.Deere on Instagram, and that's Deere. And Jim, thanks so much. Look forward to seeing you down the road, and we'll have to do a deer podcast maybe in the summer here, and I've got a bunch of questions about deer and mule deer and cow's deer or coos deer and so we can have all kinds of conversations. So thank you for your time.
Yep, I'm happy to come back. I always appreciate talking about this stuff.
Sounds good, buddy. Take care.
Thanks.